Dr. Pip Campbell, in association with Dr. Tracy West of the STEMIE Center, will now present STEM Learning Within Family Activities and Routines.
Okay, welcome to our session about infants and toddlers and learning STEM activities within the context of activities and routines. So this presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part of it is going to be about how STEM learning can be embedded in activities and routines. And the second part is going to focus on what early intervention and providers and home visitors can do to help families be able to offer children opportunities to learn STEM. In this first video that you're going to see, you're going to watch a STEM activity that's actually being carried out in a childcare program where the childcare teachers have created a STEM activity for infants and toddlers using vegetables.
So with this activity, we have a big basket of different vegetables. We talk to the children about what vegetables are in the basket, about their texture, about their color, about their feel, if they're hot, if they're cold. We'll talk about if they're smooth, if they're bumpy like the broccoli. After that, we give every child an opportunity to feel them all. We'll talk to them about, again, with the color. They'll, of course, at that age, they do a lot of mouthing. So you'll see a lot of that, and all of the vegetables will pre-wash before that. So they have an opportunity to really explore the feel and the smell of all of it. From there, we usually branch off into different aspects of what's going on. So in this particular one, we were able to take the celery that I had made little brushes out to use as a simple tool for painting for them. They always have the option to use whatever I give them. They're never limited to if it's a paintbrush, or in this case, the stalks of celery. So with that, it's helping her, just to kind of explore the feel of the paint. And it kind of enables her to broaden her aspect of her sensories with touching and whatnot. There's different aspects that we'll do with the children throughout the day, all pertaining to vegetables, and it'll all come back full circle with them coming throughout the day to that same vegetables that we've had, and they'll be able to talk about it, and throughout the week, we'll just kind of focus on those particular things in the classroom.
Now we're going to look at the fact that even though that activity was designed to be one for STEM, all activities that we do with infants and toddlers do not necessarily need to be designed. They can be created for children to be able to practice and learn concepts such as cause and effect, or how to use a tool, or other sorts of things that are important problem solving that children can learn within the context of activities and routines. So even though you just saw that video with an activity that was designed around fruits and vegetables, here we see a picture of a dad who's in a grocery store who's doing the same thing as a naturally occurring activity with his son. In the next video you're going to see is when babies are engaging in activities and routines at home, just things that parents and families do with their children. Here's a baby who's being given a bath, and watch this video and see the kinds of things that the mother does that is embedding opportunities, STEM kind of opportunities for the child within this regular activity of bath time. So this is basically how infants and toddlers learn STEM concepts. They learn them when they're playing, they learn them when they're eating their dinner, they learn them within bath time or other kinds of things, and they also learn them within play activities. But not all children are always able to access these activities easily, and some of them may require special kinds of adjustments to the activity itself, or to materials, or to other kinds of things that are going on that allow them to do two things, one of which is to access the activity, and the second of which is to be able to be engaged and participate in what's going on during the activity. So as early intervention providers and home visitors, a lot of times one of the things that you can do is to help families with adaptations so that they will be able to make sure that the activity and the routine is going to work for their particular child. So in this next video, you're going to see a mom who's doing storybook reading with her child.
Do you want to read a book? Ooh, butterflies. Do you want mommy to read that book for you? Do you want mommy to read it? Okay, here. Hush, sweet butterflies, not another peep. It's time to find a place where you can go to sleep. Touch it, it's rough.
As you can see, one of the things that she does is watch her baby and see what her baby is interested in, and then be able to follow up on that by allowing the child opportunities to participate during the book reading activity. So books are something, and storybook reading is something that is a natural routine most parents read to their children, and is something that children are able to do, in which STEM activities like having the child observe or having the child do cause and effect can be woven into that particular activity. Babies are really natural STEM learners. A lot of times people think STEM and infants are kind of incongruent, that they don't exactly go together. But really they do, because babies are natural scientists, they are natural engineers, and they are even natural technologists when you think about how they're learning about how their world works, how tools work in their world, and what are other kinds of things that they can do during that time. So it's important for us to be able to think about the fact that when we're talking about STEM learning for babies, oftentimes it's more effective if parents engage in the play with their child, and they do it in a specific way that kind of guides the child's learning and provides opportunities for the child to be able to think about what's going to happen, what are next steps, things like that. So in this next thing, if you look and you have a chart, and we're going to look at a chart, you'll see that the chart has 3 columns. The first column talks about or lists out what are some of the things that children do within or learn within the context of natural activities that actually are specific concepts related to STEM, related to, in particular, engineering, related to scientific inquiry. And you can see that they're listed as engagement, observation, exploration, experimentation, and problem solving. In the second column, you see some examples of what the adult can do within the context of any activity, with any kind of activity, to try to create opportunities for children to explore, or opportunities for children to experiment, by kind of saying to children, well, I wonder what would happen if under these circumstances, or I wonder what would happen under those. So in that previous video that you saw of the baby and the bath time, one of the things that you can think about is that with water, children get a lot of different opportunities to explore water and containers, what they can do, how they can dump things in and out, what can happen. And parents can kind of set that up by saying, well, I wonder what would happen if you used this, or if you filled this with water, or if this got dumped out, or so that children begin to learn concepts related to cause and effect, related to pouring, and things along that line. And then the final column on this chart gives some examples of adaptations and things that might have to happen or could happen when people are doing an activity that would allow a child to get access to this activity. So in this next video, you'll see that the little boy that's in this video is a child with motor disabilities. And if you notice, his arms are up in slings and are held up against gravity so that he's able to manipulate blocks and to be able to acquire some skills with blocks. So this is an example of using an adaptation, the adaptation being how his arms are held up so that he is able to engage and participate in this activity. And if you think about it, you could think about some things that the adult could say that would help promote this child to be able to do some experiments, to be able to observe what happens when the blocks fall down, to be able to see what could occur if one block was put on top of another block. All of those things that we think about as basic kinds of skills that are the beginning part of engineering concepts and the beginning part of thinking about solving problems and how things are able to go together. So these are things that really are important and that really allow people to be able to make some adjustments and think about adjustments, although the adjustments may not always be things that are related to motor abilities. The adjustments may also be things like children who are very hypersensitive and aren't so good with, having stuff be on their hands and are what we would call sensory defensive sometimes, or other kinds of labels. And in those particular cases, the adult is probably going to modify the activity so that the child isn't given something that's really, really sticky or given something that they will not be able to tolerate on their hands. So this is the first thing, is about supporting children so that they can engage in these activities and routines and being able to participate and benefit from the STEM learning that's often there. So STEM learning can occur anytime. It can occur within the context of any activity or routine. It occurs within while adults are interacting with children. It's facilitated by adults interacting with children, but not just interacting to children and talking to them and saying good job or I see you like that or whatever. Those are good things to do with children. But when we want to give children language and knowledge about STEM, we want to introduce these concepts into the activity in which they're engaging. So we do that, as I said before, by kind of mirroring what's happening, by narrating what's happening in the activity, by introducing words that are the, quote, scientific words, or the STEM words, the STEM language that would be part of that. Things like dump, things like pour, things like what would happen if, all of those kinds of things that give children both experiences, guide them to experiences, and also give them the language. So the really challenging part of all of this is not so much the adaptations, which are really often essential, particularly for children who have disabilities, but the adult language, how adults need to kind of learn a different kind of way of sort of participating and facilitating children's learning. So this is a shift, as I said, in how many adults typically interact with children, but adults can learn how to do this, and they can learn how to increase children's opportunities just by kind of narrating and orchestrating different kinds of opportunities for children to practice some of these things like exploration and experimentation or problem solving, but also for them to have opportunities to learn the use of a tool, or have opportunities to learn cause and effect or knowledge of spatial awareness. All of these very, very basic skills that are learned when babies are young in the first 18 months to 2 years of life. Many children master these concepts, but which provide the foundation for more complicated STEM learning as they get older. So thank you very much for attending this presentation. We're going to have a question and answer session afterwards. And we also have, you'll also have, I should say, not we, but you'll also have handouts that give you some examples of different kinds of things that you can share with parents so that they can learn or have examples of how activities and routines can be important foundations for STEM learning.
It's time for Q&A. Dr. Pip Campbell will answer questions about her presentation, STEM Learning Within Family, Activities and Routines. Dr. Tracy West, moderator.
Pip, we wanted to thank you for that really informative session. STEMie gets a lot of questions about what STEM can look like for infants and for toddlers. So it was great to see those examples of how the routine can be used to facilitate learning both for children, really young children with and without disabilities. So everyone, we will be monitoring Q&A, and it's a good chance to be able to ask the expert here. And Pip, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I was making some notes during your presentation, and I had a question for you. We often hear that people wonder how to really connect IFSP goals and IEP goals to STEM learning. Say if a child had a physical disability or a language goal, how could you connect that to STEM?
So in early intervention, I think that the recommended practice anyway for early intervention nationally across the country is for people to be working within the context of activities and routines. So sometimes this emphasis is more related to the kinds of relationships that providers have with families, and maybe not so much related to the specific intervention that providers are doing. In many IFSPs that I look at, the IFSP goals are most often developmentally focused. So they might be things like increased fine motor skills or increased pincher grasp, or they might be something like pay more attention to something or say particular words or whatever. But they're likely to have a developmental focus out of the basic developmental domains that we all know. So what providers have to do is they have to think about the activity and the routine. And there's many, many ways to focus on a particular activity and routine. It could be one that the parent selects. It could be, but not one that's a problem. One that the parent selects that's going well. So, for example, if you take an activity like getting out of the house, that's probably an activity where you don't want to be embedding 27 things in trying to get out of the house, right? You want to get out of the house. But let's take storybook reading as one that I think is a really easy place to start, but might not be the place that all parents want to start, but it could be a place to think about, which is usually a relaxed time when a mom and a young child are reading together, looking at a book together. And as the parent is using the STEM language to talk about, what's going on in the book, or what do you think this duck is going to do next, or whatever it is, as the parent is talking about those kinds of things and offering the child sensory opportunities and observation opportunities, et cetera, that would be related to STEM learning, you can also think about whatever the IFSP goal is and how that could be incorporated. So taking storybook just as an example to follow through on, maybe this is a child that doesn't have such great gross fine motor skills. And so maybe an opportunity to practice fine motor skills would be to be able to turn the pages on a book. So maybe the book that the child has is not necessarily a board book. Maybe it's a book with real pages. So the parent could attach clippies to those pages, or could put paper clips on them, or could put glue dots on them. There are many different ways of doing this where you separate the pages more so that the child would be able to have opportunities to practice those fine motor skills while they're reading a book that has maybe to do with something STEM-wise or scientific, while the parent is using the STEM language to be able to interact with the child during that activity. So just as I'm saying this, as I'm talking this, it sounds very complex, but I think it's not that complex. It's just that you have to think about it. I think talking about STEM does not come naturally. I think that's something that parents have to do pretty intentionally. And sometimes offering opportunities for a child to practice or do their IFSP goal does not exactly come naturally. Although for many parents, it really does come naturally. But let's say it doesn't exactly come naturally. So both of those aspects have to be thought out intentionally. And then the early intervention provider, the home visitor, whoever it is, then has to support the parent in being able to kind of use those things while they're doing that kind of activity with a child. So that's a very long answer. I think just to very quickly say, don't try an activity or routine that isn't going well. Make sure the activity or routine is going well. Think about adaptations that you might need where the child can actually access and participate in the activity. And then think about the language that a parent would use to facilitate the child's participation and STEM learning. That makes it sound not so complicated, I think.
Yeah, and thank you, Pip. That was really helpful because making that connection is so important when you're trying to work on goals as a home visitor or a practitioner. We have a question from LaTanya, and she wondered, are there limits to STEM activities for children with disabilities?
I think what the limitation would be how creative and how thoughtful and how intentional the adult can be. So as long as the teacher or the early childhood person or the early intervention person or the parents are really good at this stuff when they know, when they kind of understand what it is that is important for them to do. Many parents can do it really, really well without a lot of instruction. But I think the limits are not to the child, but to the adults around the child. And also maybe to the environment, how creative we can be about adapting the environment, adapting the materials, adapting the activity. Those kinds of things are things that make a child, no matter how disabled they might be, whether they're really intellectually disabled or motor disabled or whatever, those are the kinds of things that allow the child to access the activity and participate in the activity, no matter what their, quote, limitations may be. So that's the onus of that is really on the adult. How can the adult think these things up, put them in place, get them to work? And as long as the adult can do that, then I think that children with disabilities can participate in any STEM activity whatsoever. And I mean, I might not be thinking fast enough on my feet, but I cannot think of an example right off the top of my head of a child that would not be able to do this, would not be able to do something. I mean, at a bottom line, even if a child has significant intellectual disability, let's say, even if a child has significant intellectual disability, there are still things that they can do. They can still participate in a sensory way. They can still participate by observing. The parent can set up some activities or some ways in which the child would be able to do some of the other things like problem solve, et cetera. So I think that that's really important. We have to think about all children can do everything as long as the adults can do it, right? As long as the adults are creative enough and smart enough and can figure out these go-arounds, because that's really what it's all about, using go-arounds, adaptations, et cetera, for the child to be able to access and participate.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful. Thinking about it really does come back to us, the adults, to use that creativity and figure out the adaptations that individualize there.
So I just want to say one more thing about that. And that has to do with expectations. If adults have expectations that children can't do these things, then that's a huge limitation right there, because then adults don't make opportunities available. And parents can always, and early intervention people, any adult who's around a child can always talk it, right? They can always talk the language. They can always use the STEM language. And maybe over time, the child is able to understand some of that language because it's been used so frequently with them.
Great. Thank you, Pip. And we have another question that's come in. It says, you've mentioned infants and toddlers could learn STEM concepts in natural settings. If so, how do you conceptualize differently between science concepts and STEM concepts, or maybe science versus STEM activities? But kind of getting that broader STEM versus science, I think.
So I think one of the ways I think of doing that is by thinking of these cross-cutting concepts. So earlier, maybe some of you were in Daryl's presentation, and he showed and talked a lot about cross-cutting concepts, which are also, you can also find some of that referenced on the 0 to 3 website and in a variety of other locations. So what we're focused on always, I think in this STEMIE project, is we're focused on things that cross across all of those things, that cross across science, cross across engineering, cross across technology and across math, and that some activities are more likely to be maybe more related to more related, let's say, to math than they are to science, or maybe some are more related to technology than they are to engineering. But there's certain concepts that go across all those activities, and those have been these cross-cutting concepts that we have focused on a lot within what's been done so far in STEMIE. This presentation, as I said before, that Daryl Greenberg did, really talks about this quite a lot and describes it quite a lot. So that could be something that you could watch his presentation, or go to 0 to 3 and read some of the articles that are on the 0 to 3 resources, 0to3.org, resources where this is discussed in more detail.
Great. Thank you, Pip. And I have to share that Peggy put in, she really loved that idea that all children can do it as long as the adults are smart enough and creative enough. A good way for all of us to think of it. We have a question from Ms. Eva, and she wondered if you have a form that lists different STEM vocabulary that's good to use when you're with infants and toddlers as you're starting out.
I do not have that form, but I'm sure I could find that form somewhere. That's actually a good idea. I hadn't even thought about that, but that probably would be a very helpful thing for people to be able to just think about those things more concretely. And as I say, while I don't personally have that, and I can't think of one at the moment off the top of my head, I know I could find one. and that someone among the many people that are collaborating on this STEMIE project probably have access to something like that or know something like that. We could definitely make that available, I think.
Thank you. Yes, that would be really helpful. And it varies so much depending on activities.
Right.
Another question I had, Pip, is we often hear from home visitors, practitioners, that they aren't sure how to introduce family members to those basic STEM concepts you mentioned, cause and effect, just the idea of how important those could be. Do you have any thoughts on engaging families in that way?
Well, I think that partly depends on, I think it partly depends on how the home visitors or whoever's interacting with families, how they begin to communicate this to families. So because of the way things are in early intervention, where they're frequently, not always, but frequently developmentally based, I think parents are more in tune to those things that you can easily observe. So you can easily observe that the child isn't talking, or the child isn't walking, or people can't understand the child, or the child is frustrated trying to explain themselves, or any of those very obvious developmental sorts of things. But the concepts that we're talking about that are related to at least STEM learning early on are things that we might also consider to be cognitive concepts. And these are things like cause and effect, like use of a tool, all of those basic kinds of things that are really cognitively based, that I don't think we find them so frequently included on developmental assessments necessarily. Therefore, I don't think people have such a tendency to talk with families about that. Or do families have necessarily a natural tendency to observe that? I mean, I think it would be hard to observe that your child doesn't understand cause and effect unless somebody showed that to you. So maybe what early intervention and home visitors and people that are dealing with families need to think about is how can they communicate, how can they show families some of these basic concepts, like cause and effect would be a good one to start with. And how can they give families examples of cause and effect and examples of things that they could observe their children do or not do to be able to kind of identify sort of what's the child's understanding of cause and effect. That might be a place to start, because unless you set up, unless you're really a good observer and you know what you're looking for. So I don't think a lot of people are looking for cause and effect. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I, sell this down the river too much, but that's, I think, what we first have to do is to teach people how to look for it, and then to think about what it is that children need to know or need to demonstrate in order to be able to show their learning of STEM things.
Yes, great. That really does help introduce that and the importance of it. And remember, everyone type in your questions and answers into Q&A. And Pip, I had one more I wanted to ask about. When you talked about individualizing and how important it was to make adaptations for children, do you have resources you'd recommend for people who are looking for ideas?
I think a primary resource about adaptations is something called CARES Kit. Many of you have probably seen that. It's been around for a long time. So we actually have two CARES kits. There's one CARES kit that you can obtain through the Division of Early Childhood through DEC. And that's a CARES kit that is focused more on giving examples of activities and routines and giving examples of adaptations that would fit more with preschool. and more with a classroom kind of a base. And then we have a second CARES kit called CARES Kit for Infants and Toddlers, which is available through Paul Brooks Publishing, or both of these, I'm sure. The Paul Brooks one is definitely also available on Amazon. But and that's one that focuses more on home activities and routines, and also the sorts of activities and routines that you might see in an infant or an infant toddler childcare program. But both of them use the same framework, where they use a framework of thinking about what are the different adaptations, and how can you think of those adaptations in relationship to giving a child access and giving a child the ability, increasing the ability to participate in activities and routines. And all of the adaptations that are included in both of these CARAs. CARA is about adapting the environment, adapting the materials, adapting what's around it. And an example that's often given is that when you have a flower that is not growing or does not thrive, you don't necessarily do something to the flower. What you do is you do something to the environment. So you maybe change the soil, or maybe you stake the flower up if it's like, falling over or something. But your intervention is not directly to the flower. So that's an analogy to say that with CARA, your intervention is not about therapy to get the kid to open and close their hand better, or therapy to get the child to talk better. It's more about what can we do within the child's environment, physical environment, the activity, the materials, how instruction is provided to the child, all of those sorts of things that enhance a child's ability to be successful. So those are two examples that are available. And there are other books that are more focused on curriculum and more focused on preschool that also include a lot in them about adaptations and adapting the curriculum, adapting the environment, the preschool environment. And those are very helpful, I think, also in looking at what that is. So maybe in your handouts, we'll also put the CARA adaptation chart, what we call the adaptation hierarchy, which starts with adapting the environment and goes all the way down to thinking about how the child is receiving instructions, thinking about how the child is communicating, what adaptations would be necessary for that, thinking about how you adapt the materials, what can you do to the activity itself to make it more successful. And that would be at least show you the framework. And the books are good references. I think people really like them.
Yeah, I agree. And Pip, if we could post that part, the framework from CARA's kit, that would be so helpful, because it's very down to earth, very clear, and gives people those steps they need to start thinking about how to adapt for individual children.
Yes, we could certainly do that.
That would be great. So any other questions? I see people are already looking in for the handouts. And Pip, any closing remarks, any advice for really thinking about STEM with babies? I know that's always mystifying for people.
I think it is mystifying, but I also think that the most interesting thing is that babies are doing it anyway. We just don't call it that, right? Babies are already taking a bath and splashing in water, and babies are already out in their baby pool dumping things, and babies are dumping water, and babies are already, if you let them crawl around in the yard, they're already, digging in dirt and eating grass, and, they're already experimenting and exploring and trying to figure out what goes on. We just, I think, as adults have not necessarily identified that as being as being related to concepts of science or engineering or math or technology. I don't think people as a whole would think that when the child throws their spoon over the edge of the high chair, which anyone who's ever worked in infants and who has had their own infant or toddler infant has seen a baby throw spoons over the edge of a high chair. But I don't think people would say, oh, that child is learning cause and effect. Mm-hmm. That child is learning when I throw the spoon over, it makes a noise, it disappears. I don't think people are really thinking about it that way. They're just thinking about the child throwing, putting the spoon over the edge of the tray. So, but there's a very good example of STEM learning. It's just that the adult doesn't exactly identify it that way. So I think the first thing is that with babies is that we have to think about, A, they're doing it anyway, and B, we need to identify those things that we can observe where they are doing it, so we can put the STEM language on top of it, so we can narrate it, we can talk it through, we can say, oh, that spoon went over the edge of the tray, or you threw that spoon on the floor and it made a noise, so that we can begin to highlight for babies what it is that these scientific and other kinds of concepts are that are related, that make this STEM, that make everyday activities and routines actually a STEM curriculum.
Great. Thank you, Pip. And you're right. That goes back to what you were saying earlier about that intentionality, knowing what it is you're trying to facilitate and then being able to build on that. There's a comment in chat from someone who says they share about cause and effect with parents so that they don't get as frustrated when a child keeps throwing that spoon down over and over again.
Very good idea.
Exactly. And a number of you are asking about the handouts and about accessing the session, and the session will be recorded and posted online. And if you've had trouble getting the handouts, we'll find a way to make sure that you have the link so that you can access all of those. And we'll upload the framework from the document from CareKits as well. So Pip, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here and sharing your expertise with us.
Well, thank you.
It was a pleasure to be here with you. And with all of you, join us at STEMIEFest, back at STEMIEFest today and for the next 3 days. Thank you all for being here.